Good stories are worth retelling, such as Bram Stoker's Dracula, about the undead count who moves from Transylvania to London to seek fresh new blood. Since its publication in 1897, it has popularized the vampire myth, lasting throughout the generations, branching from literature to films, TV, and video games. It even seems to have inspired modern horror trends like walking into an unfamiliar creepy place, doctors being powerless to stop an illness or possession, and heroes joining forces to hunt down an evil being. It's no stretch to say the book Dracula is like the holy gospel of horror fiction, not forgetting Frankenstein, Dracula being the supernatural one and Frankenstein being more scientific. There is no Dracula film adaptation that copies the book exactly. If there was, it would probably be at least 20 hours long. Of course, movies usually omit or change things as they see fit to better suit the cinematic medium and to better appeal to the audiences of the time. But regardless, wouldn't you like to know, of all the Dracula films, counting theatrical, TV, and direct-to-video, which one follows the book the closest? Oddly, it seems there's no universal consensus. Every forum I've read turns it into a debate based on personal opinion, but this isn't meant to be a subjective question. I want to know which one is most faithful to the book, not what's everybody's favorites. Curiosity overcame me, and I decided to do the digging myself, watching the films and cross-examining them with Stoker's original text in a mission to determine which one contains the most source material and the least amount of drastic departures. There exists probably hundreds of Dracula films. Most of them have hardly anything to do with the book, so first we must filter them out. The Monster Squad is an example of a film that has Dracula in it, but is not trying to follow the book. Then there's Mel Brooks's Dracula Dead and Loving It, which actually does follow many events from the book, but its primary purpose is comedy. In Son of Dracula, the Count takes the form of mist. In Dracula Prince of Darkness, he makes Mina drink his blood, and in Scars of Dracula, he climbs on the castle wall. These are all very specific elements from the book, but otherwise these films have almost nothing to do with it. Also, they were made as installments in a series. In short, we're not counting the 3 S's: sequels, spin-offs, and spoofs. So which ones are actually up for the test? I've been able to narrow it down to 12 movies, the Dracula dozen. The titles don't offer much distinction. 5 are called Dracula, 2 say Count Dracula, 3 include the name Bram Stoker, and many have multiple titles. So as I introduce them, I'm going to have to assign them nicknames. The first is Nosferatu, the silent version from 1922. Even though it's an unofficial adaptation and changed many things such as the characters' names to avoid a lawsuit, it still follows the basic story and is the oldest surviving relic to have done so. No nickname needed. Next, from 1931, is the first sound versions, 2 of them, both titled Dracula, made by Universal Studios, filmed simultaneously. One for English-speaking audience, the other for Spanish-speaking audience, each with different actors. The English version is famous mostly for Bela Lugosi, so I'll call it the Lugosi version. The other has Carlos Villarreal, but it's commonly known as simply the Spanish version. I'll refer to them together as the Universal versions, even though they're not the only ones produced by Universal. From 1953 is an extremely rare one from Turkey based on a novel of its own that was basically translated from Stoker's. It's called Dracula in Instanbul, but is usually called the Turkish version. From 1958 is the first color version starring Christopher Lee made by Hammer Studios. It was originally called Dracula, but in the United States it became Horror of Dracula. I'll just call it the Hammer version. From 1970, directed by Jesus Franco, is another one starring Christopher Lee, but in no way is it connected to the Hammer films. It was a Spanish, German, Italian, British production and had too many titles around the world to count. In the States, I always knew it as Bram Stoker's Count Dracula, but I'll call it the Franco version. From 1973 is the made-for-TV version, which had its air date delayed until '74. It was a British production directed by Dan Curtis and starring Jack Palance as Dracula. It was originally called Bram Stoker's Dracula, shortened to just plain Dracula in the States. Nowadays on video streaming services, it usually comes up as Dan Curtis's Dracula, but since I find Jack Palance to be a more familiar person, I'll call it the Palance version. From 1977 is another British TV version produced by the BBC. It was called Count Dracula, but we'll call it the BBC version. From 1979 is the other Universal version starring Frank Langella, titled just plain Dracula. Let's call it the Langella version. Also in 1979 is the remake of Nosferatu directed by Werner Herzog, starring Klaus Kinski, who funny enough played Renfield in the Franco version, but now he's been promoted to playing Dracula. It was a German production shot in 2 languages. In one version the actors speak German, in the other they speak English, but otherwise it's the same exact movie. It's not like the Universal versions where they use different actors, different directors, and were shot differently. Here it's almost identical. Originally it was called Nosferatu Phantom of the Night and had several titles, but seems to most widely be known as Nosferatu the Vampyre. Either way, we'll call it the Nosferatu remake. From 1992 is yet another Bram Stoker's Dracula starring Gary Oldman, directed by Francis Ford Coppola. This was a huge, big-budget, lavish production, widely recognized in the mainstream. Even though it made such a big claim to the Stoker name, I will always call it Coppola's Dracula. At last, from 2006, we have another BBC version. You'd think by now they'd get a little more creative with these titles, but it's as bland as they come. Dracula. Let's call it the BBC 06 version. Now that I've introduced the Dracula dozen, let me reiterate, there exist plenty of other Dracula films. These are just the ones I find to be worthy contenders as being the most faithful to the book. And it's always possible another rare, undiscovered one can turn up later. The Turkish version, for example, I didn't find out about until the last minute. Let's start by looking at the most drastic departures. We know that each film takes its own liberties, inventing its own material that was never in the book. In Nosferatu, an entire plague happens, killing the population of a town, and there's a chase scene through the streets where the crazy maniac Renfield is on the loose. In both the classic Universal versions, it's Renfield who travels to Transylvania to sell a property to Dracula, where originally it was Jonathan Harker. There's also an added comic relief character, Martin. In the Turkish version, the setting of 1890s London is changed to 1950s Istanbul, and the character Mina is turned into a showgirl. In the Hammer version, character relationships are switched. Originally, Mina is married to Jonathan and Lucy is engaged to Arthur, but here, Mina is married to Arthur and Lucy is engaged to Jonathan, just to be confusing. Lucy is now Arthur's sister, and also Jonathan is hunting Dracula from the beginning and poses as Dracula's new librarian, and on top of that, Jonathan is turned into a vampire and is killed or destroyed by Van Helsing. In the Franco version, there's a scene where the heroes are attacked by taxidermied animals. Renfield obeys a command by Dracula to kill Mina, and Van Helsing has a stroke. In the Palance version, Dracula considers Lucy to be the reincarnation of his dead wife, and Dracula is explained to be the same historical figure as Vlad the Impaler. Contrary to popular belief, that connection was never explicitly made in the book, even though Dracula's backstory had similarities. In the BBC 77 version, Mina and Lucy are sisters. Arthur and Quincy are combined into a hybrid character, and there's a bunch of weird video effects. In the Langella version, Lucy and Mina are switched. Lucy has a romance with Dracula. Van Helsing uses a horse to locate Mina's grave. Dracula kills Van Helsing, and there's weird laser effects consulted by James Bond title designer Maurice Binder. In the Nosferatu remake, Lucy and Mina are again switched. For some reason in 1979, that was just a thing. Van Helsing is a non-believer who knows nothing of vampire lore, and Jonathan Harker becomes a vampire. Coppola's version really takes the cake. It makes an explicit connection to Vlad the Impaler, as if taking cue from the Palance version. It has a huge opening introduction explaining Dracula's origin, which has nothing to do with the book. Mina attempts to seduce and kill Van Helsing. Renfield was Jonathan's predecessor in the real estate business. The costumes and production design are heavily exaggerated. Dracula has a baboon's butt on his head. He draws a sword on Jonathan, has a romance with Mina, considers her the reincarnation of his dead wife, again drawing similarities to the Palance version, and they try to make Dracula sympathetic. In the BBC 06 version, Arthur has a disease that eats away at his skin. He seeks a cure from an occult leader named Singleton who's working for Dracula. Arthur points a gun at Dr. Seward, forcing him to perform the blood transfusion on Lucy. Dracula kills both Jonathan and Arthur, and in the final shot, Dracula is still alive. I didn't even get into all of Dracula's different deaths yet, but I will. The point is, each version has its share of deviations. We could probably keep adding to the list with no clear answer when to stop, and that's where I'm beginning to see the project can be a little subjective. If we're going to pick a winner, I think we'll find more value in adding up what elements the films do include from the book. So here's what we'll do. We'll give each film a point for every character and event included, and the film with the most points wins. For now, we'll put aside the deviations and bring them up again only as a deciding factor in the event of a tie or to help confirm in a close race. Okay, let's start with the characters. It's important to note that Nosferatu and the Turkish version changed all the names. With Nosferatu, you might have seen it with the regular names because when it was translated from German to English and all the title cards were switched out, the altered names were switched to their regular names, and that became the public domain version, which was most common for a while. So to clarify, we're not looking for the exact names, we're looking for the roles. If you can recognize the character, it counts. Now, let the competition begin. Keep your eye on the score if you'd like, and place your bets. Renfield is usually included. He's only missing from the Turkish, Hammer, Palance, and BBC 06 version. The Turkish version has a hunchback servant with a very phony mustache. He's never in an asylum or fits the character. In Nosferatu, he was originally named Knock. In the two classic Universal versions, Renfield does overtime, taking over the role of Jonathan, only for the Transylvania scenes. Jonathan Harker is in all across the board. In Nosferatu, he's called Hutter. In the Spanish version, he's called Juan. In the Turkish version, he's called Azmi. In the Hammer and Langella versions, he's engaged to Lucy instead of Mina. Mina is in all of them. In Nosferatu, she's called Ellen, but in the English translation, she's Nina. In the Spanish version, she's Eva. In the Turkish version, she's Guzin. In the Langella version and Nosferatu remake, she's named Lucy, even though the role is clearly Mina. In the Nosferatu remake, there's a separate character named Mina who is extremely minor, appearing in one brief talking scene and later as a dead body. Lucy appears in all of them, except for both Nosferatus. The original Nosferatu has a character named Ruth who was switched to Lucy for the English version, but she's too minor and not connected to the character. In the Turkish version, she's named Sedan, and in the Langella version, as already stated, she's switched to Mina. Arthur Holmwood first appeared in the Turkish version named Turan. After that, he was pretty regular, appearing in Hammer, Franco, Palance, Coppola, BBC 06. In the Franco version, they call him Quincy, even though he's engaged to Lucy and seems to mostly fit the Arthur role. Also, the original BBC version, as already mentioned, combines him with Quincy Morris, even merging their names, Quincy Holmwood. Is he more Quincy or more Arthur? It's pretty equal, and I can't give 2 points for one hybrid character, so half a point. Quincy Morris, the least favorite character, apparently. BBC gets the other half point here, but Coppola is the only version to have the real character. Way to go, Coppola. Dr. Seward is in most of them. He's missing from Palance and Nosferatu remake, and in Hammer, he's way too minor. It's just a quick walk-on role, and with no Renfield for him to interact with, you'd never know it's him except for the name. In Nosferatu, he's Professor Sievers. In Turkish, he's Dr. Afif, and in BBC 06, they just call him by his first name, John. But you also have Jonathan Harker, so why on earth would you call him John? Dr. Van Helsing is in all of them except the original Nosferatu. There's a minor character named Professor Bulwer. For the English version, they changed him to Van Helsing, but he does absolutely nothing important. Of course, you can't have a Dracula film without Dracula, so he's always there. I could give away an easy point for all, but that makes no difference either way, so let's take a step further. Which one stays true to Dracula's physical appearance? In the book, he's described as an old man with a mustache. Well, do you see the mustache? Nope, 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 yes, nope, 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 nope. A dozen Dracula films, and the only one where Dracula actually looks like Dracula is the Franco version. Big gold medal for Franco. Now let's get into the other elements from the book. First, the castle is depicted in every film, so that's a wash, I guess. Some of them use actual locations, which makes me beg the question, why not a single one of them, not even for a quick exterior shot, used a famous Romanian location like Paneri or Bran Castle? In the book, Dracula de-ages. As he obtains fresh blood, he gets younger. A simple makeup effect, and nobody wanted to do it except for Franco, Coppola, and BBC 06. Dracula turns into a bat. This happens in all except Nosferatu, Hammer, and Palance. Hammer even says explicitly that Dracula changing into a bat is a common fantasy, but everything else that happens is perfectly believable. The Turkish version has the most hilarious bat, and Coppola has the most exaggerated. Dracula turns into a wolf or a large dog. This happens in Lugosi, though it's off-screen. With Franco, I'm not sure if the dog in the picture is Dracula. It's a random shot that comes out of nowhere, and the dog has a collar, but they mention Dracula can change into a wolf, so it counts. In Palance, a dog gets shot down and dies, so it can't be Dracula. BBC, Langella, and Coppola all get a point. However, Coppola's, again, is pretty far out there. Dracula can turn into mist. Spanish, BBC, Langella, Coppola, all get a point. Simple. Dracula can climb walls like a lizard. First happens in Turkish, then BBC, Langella, and Coppola. Done. Dracula has no reflection in the mirror. Both Universals, BBC, Langella, Nosferatu remake, and Coppola. With Palance, I'm really not sure. The scene gives nothing to indicate that Dracula has no reflection. Every film explains that Dracula can only sleep in his native soil, which I've always wondered, wouldn't he be all dirty? Dracula's repelled by a cross or crucifix. Pretty classic. It's in all of them except Nosferatu and Turkish. Garlic, another classic repellent. It's used in Turkish, Hammer, Palance, BBC, Langella, and Coppola. Lugosi switches it for wolfsbane, and Spanish has an unspecified wreath of flowers, the word garlic not being used. The sacred wafer, used many times in the book, but only shows up in 3 of the films, BBC, Nosferatu remake, and Coppola. Here's a shocker. In the book, Dracula is sighted outside in the daytime. That's right, sunlight does not kill him. It only weakens his powers. In Nosferatu, there is a shot where he's out in the day, which you may think is a flub or a contradiction to the film's ending where he's killed by sunlight, but it was actually a day-for-night shot, filmed at day but takes place at night. It's not obvious unless you see it with the original blue color tinting. The only films where Dracula is really out in the day are both BBC versions and Coppola. In the first BBC, Dracula is the coachman, but you don't see him until the end of the scene, which ends at night. So assuming he was driving the horses the whole time, that would have meant he was out in the day. It's tricky, but I think it counts. In Langella, Dracula says he can move about in the day, but that's only if he stays in a dark spot. The sunlight still kills him. A big thing about the book was that it was written with multiple narrators through journal entries. It's kind of like the equivalent of a modern-day found-footage horror film. It gave it a realistic vibe. In the movies, it would be simple to have voiceovers with all the characters. Hammer begins with Jonathan Harker narrating, but he's the only one. Later, Van Helsing is seen speaking into a phonograph, but it's not voiceover. Even in the BBC 06 version, Jonathan is the only one who ever narrates. So, a big award goes to Coppola for being the only film to honor this very distinguishable trait of the book. Now, let's get into the main plot in rough chronological order. First, I have to say, it's hard to establish a consistent criteria. I'll have to make a judgment call on a case-by-case basis. I say characters and locations can be changed as long as the event is the same. It can also happen off-screen as long as it's explained. So first we have Jonathan Harker traveling to Transylvania. Each movie acknowledges it in some way, with some liberties. The Universal versions have Renfield instead, the Hammer version has Harker arriving to destroy Dracula, but the one that I think crosses the line is the Langella version because none of the traveling takes place. Harker never goes to Transylvania, he only meets Dracula at Carfax Abbey after he's already sold it to him. So that first act never happens. The scared townspeople who warn Jonathan not to go to the castle. This happens in every version except Langella. In Hammer, they warn Van Helsing, and in Palance, it's very subtle, but the cliché is still there. It takes place on St. George's Eve, which the townspeople say is when the powers of evil are strongest. It's sort of like Halloween, which was formerly known as Hallows' Eve, the night before All Hallows' Day. The only films that make mention of it are Franco and BBC. The Universal versions change it to Walpurgis Night, so if you want to celebrate more holidays like Halloween, there you go. The coachman who brings Jonathan to the castle is Dracula. Happens in Nosferatu, the Universals, Turkish, Franco, BBC, and Coppola. With Palance, it's hard to tell, but I doubt that's Jack Palance's nose. The first sign of Dracula's power is when wolves surround the coach and Dracula gets down and shoos them away. It only happens in the Franco version. Coppola shows us some wolves before Dracula arrives, but there's nothing to indicate that he's the one who made them go away. I've always wondered why Jonathan has to go all the way to Transylvania to conduct business with Dracula. Could they do it by mail? Well, in the book, Dracula says the reason is so he can learn from Jonathan about English culture. It's only made clear in Hammer, Franco, and BBC. In Langella and Coppola, Dracula says he can't wait to walk the London streets, but still doesn't clarify the education he wants to get from Harker being there. Jonathan sells him the property in England. It happens in every version except Hammer. In most cases, the property is Carfax Abbey, like in the book, but in the Turkish version, Jonathan is a lawyer selling him kiosks in Istanbul. Property, nevertheless. The wolves howl, and Dracula says, "Listen to them, children of the night, what music they make." It's in most versions. Sometimes the line is altered slightly, such as the Langella version, where he says, "What sad music they make." But as we already know, the movies all take liberties. 3 vampire women seduce Jonathan. Dracula comes in and shoos them away. It happens in all of them except both Nosferatu's, Langella, and BBC 06. In Turkish and Hammer, there's only one girl, but the event plays out just the same. Dracula gives the vampire women a baby to feed on. This ghastly deed only happens in Franco, BBC, and Coppola. Jonathan discovers Dracula asleep in his coffin. This happens in every version except all 3 that Universal produced. Jonathan learns he's a prisoner in the castle and makes several escape attempts. Most versions show him trying to get away. Again, keeping in mind the 2 classic Universal versions call him Renfield here, but after this point, both characters are reinstated to their appropriate roles. Dracula travels to England aboard a ship called the Demeter and kills everybody on board. Most films depict the captain tied to the wheel, but the only ones that ignore the event altogether are Turkish, Hammer, and Franco. Mina waits for her husband Jonathan to arrive, accompanied by her friend Lucy. In both Nosferatus, she waits alone, but the idea is the same. In Langella, she's not waiting for Jonathan, she's talking to Van Helsing about vampire lore, so we can scratch that. The book takes place in a cemetery on a cliff overlooking the sea. Bram Stoker based this on an actual location in Whitby, and the geography he describes is spot on, mentioning a nearby church, an abbey, a fishing port, and stone steps leading up the cliff. It all exists in real life, and the first BBC version gets a big point for filming it at the actual location. The Turkish version doesn't use a cemetery, but they find similar steps, and the basic event is still acknowledged. Renfield is observed at the asylum for his odd habits of eating flies. It's meant to be Dr. Seward who observes him, but in the Universals it's changed to Martin. In the Nosferatu remake, it's Van Helsing, and Langella has Seward in the scene, but doesn't directly interact. Either way, in most of the films, Renfield's in the asylum. Lucy sleepwalks. Most of the films portray this scene, even though it's always different. As I mentioned, many of the films switch her name with Mina. Both Nosferatus don't even have a Lucy equivalent, more or less combining them. The only ones that don't have the sleepwalking are BBC 06 and Langella, where she's kinda walking around in a room, but I think she's awake and bored. Dracula preys upon Lucy. In the book, she sleepwalks outside, up the steps, into the cemetery, and that's where Dracula sucks her blood. Most films depict this scene, however the details are always different. In both Nosferatus, Dracula is biting Jonathan's neck in Transylvania, while back at home, Mina or Lucy or whatever you want to call her, is affected in some kind of telepathic way. We can scratch those. Lugosi, Spanish, Turkish, Hammer, Langella, all move the encounter to her bedroom, while Franco, Palance, BBC, and Coppola keep it outside. BBC 06 is the only one that reserves the entire encounter for when Dracula makes Mina drink his blood, leaving no equivalent of the Lucy encounter. Lucy is ill with bite marks on her neck, giving the first clue to the other characters that something is going on. The first Nosferatu is the only one that ignores it entirely. In the Universals, she's dead immediately, but the important clue is still found. The Lugosi version was too uptight to show you the bite marks, while the Spanish version didn't hold back. The Langella version, just a reminder, is Mina here, as is the Nosferatu remake, but here she doesn't get bitten until the very end, meaning the bite marks do not serve as a clue. Lucy's condition is examined and she's given a blood transfusion. Nosferatu ignores it. In the Universals, she's already dead. The rest all have it, but a few minor things to note. In Franco, it's Dr. Seward who takes charge, when in the book, it's Van Helsing. Langella, I had to debate because of the name switch, and the event happens in a different time in the story, but still, I think it counts. In BBC 06, it's Seward who does the transfusion because, as I already said, Arthur points a gun to him. Dr. Van Helsing educates everybody on vampire lore. Pretty simple. Every movie has it except both Nosferatus. Lucy, now as a vampire, preys on young children. Most of them have it. In the Universals, it's read in a newspaper. In the others, it's usually shown as a young child or infant. The Langella version is the only one that actually has the nerve to depict a dead baby. Jeez, we get the idea. Van Helsing confronts the vampire Lucy. It happens in more than half the films. Typically, she's repelled by a cross or crucifix. The Turkish version uses garlic. Reminder, with Langella, it's confusing. They have an encounter with both Mina and Lucy separately, which gives two possible scenes to count. But the later scene actually has the cross used on the character named Lucy. Van Helsing frees Lucy's soul by driving a wooden stake through her heart. Both Nosferatus ignore it. With the Lugosi version, they cut all the explanation because back then, God forbid, you couldn't even talk about a stake going through a heart, even though it was in the damn book. So Lucy just disappears from the film. They never tell you what happened with her or why they're standing in front of a cemetery. The Spanish version doesn't mess around. It explains what happened without having to see it. The rest are pretty straightforward. Next, they stuff Lucy's mouth with garlic. Rock on BBC, the only one. After that, they cut off her head. Points for Turkish, Franco, BBC, and Coppola. Rats, rats, Renfield's monologue where he describes Dracula's offer. All three Universal versions include it. The two classics got the whole speech almost verbatim. In the Langella version, it's only partly used and is rushed, but it's still there. Renfield begs Dr. Seward to let him out of the asylum because he knows if he stays there, something bad will happen to Mina. It's in the two Universals, BBC, and in Coppola, he only talks to Mina directly. What I'm looking for is not really there. Dracula kills Renfield. Pretty simple. 5 of them have it. In the two Universals, he strangles them and throws them down a staircase. In BBC, it happens off screen. In Langella, he twists his head around, and in Coppola, he turns to green mist and slams Renfield repeatedly into the prison bars. The heroes locate Dracula's boxes of soil and contaminate them. The book is really big on holy wafers, but in the movies, the methods they use vary. In Turkish, they seal garlic under the lids. In Franco and Palance, it's not really clear exactly how. In BBC, it's holy wafers like in the book. In Coppola, it's the works. They use holy water, they read from a Bible, and they burn the whole place down. When they're sanctifying the boxes, they get creeped out. Arthur sees Dracula's face in the dark, and then the whole place comes alive with rats. Only Franco, BBC, and Coppola acknowledge this brief encounter. Franco deviates by having a bunch of taxidermied animals start moving. In BBC, it's all in the dialogue, and Coppola, it shows the rats, except it's in a bedroom instead of Carfax Abbey. Dracula forces Mina to drink his blood, beginning her slow transformation into a vampire. It happens in 7 of the films. In the Universals, Mina describes it, obviously since it was too gruesome to show. The later versions not only show it, but imply Mina is doing it willingly and even enjoys it. In Langella, it's Lucy. BBC 06 also gives this scene to Lucy. There's a standoff with Dracula where the heroes use crosses and other things to send him back, jumping through a window. As you can see, most of the films include the confrontation. Usually it's a cross, but in Turkish, I think it's garlic. Mina develops a psychic link to Dracula. She's the only one who knows he's traveling back to Transylvania. Palance, BBC, and Coppola are the only ones to acknowledge this. In Palance and Coppola, Van Helsing hypnotizes her, like in the book. But in BBC, he just straight up asks her. Either way, the psychic connection is retained. They all follow Dracula to Transylvania. Half of the films preserve this final act. Even though it differs some, you'll see it in all the color films except Langella, Nosferatu Remake, and BBC 06. Van Helsing and Mina encounter the 3 vampire brides outside of Dracula's castle. Van Helsing creates a protection by making a circle of holy wafers, only in BBC and Coppola. These 2 films are really duking it out. The vampire brides are found sleeping in their coffins. In the book, it's Van Helsing who hunts them down. In Hammer, it's Jonathan. In Franco, it's Jonathan and Arthur who's named Quincy. The rest, it's Van Helsing. In the book, Van Helsing stakes them through the heart and cuts their heads off. In only 5 of the films are the brides killed. In Hammer, Franco, Palance, and BBC, it's just the stake. In Coppola, only the heads are cut off, no stake. Dracula is transported by traveling gypsies. Franco, BBC, and Coppola. The heroes battle the gypsies. Franco, BBC, and Coppola. The hero seize Dracula's coffin. Franco, BBC, and Coppola yet again. Now the big one, Dracula's Death. The heroes kill him in every film, but are any of them close enough to the book? In the book, he's killed by ordinary knives. Jonathan slashes his throat while Quincy stabs his heart. Well, in Nosferatu, it's sunlight. Nope. In the Universals, Van Helsing drives a wooden stake through his heart. Nope. In Turkish, it's a stake and decapitation. Not quite. In Hammer, it's sunlight. Nope. In Franco, it's fire. Nope. In Palance, Van Helsing impales him with a spear with some sunlight for good measure. Nope. In BBC, it's Van Helsing with the stake again. Nope. In Langella, he's hung on a ship hook and struck by sunlight. Nope. In the Nosferatu remake, it's sunlight again, plus Van Helsing stakes him off screen. Nope. In Coppola, it's knives. Jonathan goes for his throat, Quincy goes for the heart. Wow. Somebody finally got it right. In BBC 06, it's a stake through the back. Nope. And in the final shot, he's alive again. Well, that one's sure off the mark. With Coppola, there are differences. In the book, Dracula never gets out of the coffin, but in the movie, he gets up and tries to fight back. In the book, right after the knives, he crumbles to dust immediately, but in the movie, he and Mina go into the castle to have one last melodramatic dying scene. With all that aside, Dracula is killed by the correct characters with the correct weapons, targeting the correct places on the body. It's the only film that comes close enough. Next, Quincy dies from wounds inflicted from the battle with the gypsies, only in BBC and Coppola. And at last, in the final chapter, the rest of the characters return to Transylvania years later to pay their respects to Quincy. Only the BBC version includes this final scene. And here's the final score. As you can see, the 1977 BBC version comes out on top, but the Coppola version trails very close behind. One could argue that there are other plot points to consider, so there is a margin of debate. For that reason, I think it's worth bringing up again all the creative departures each film brings to the table. As said before, BBC has the weird video effects, Mina and Lucy are sisters, and Quincy and Arthur are combined. All pretty minor things. Coppola, on the other hand, has the Vlad connection, the Dracula origin story, Renfield as Jonathan's predecessor, the weird costumes, the butt wig, Dracula's sword, the romance with Mina, the reincarnation, the sympathy for Dracula, Mina seducing Van Helsing, and the list goes on and on. I think it's safe to say the Coppola version invents far more stuff than the BBC version, and it's my assessment that the Coppola version is primarily Coppola's vision, not Bram Stoker's, even though it still uses a commendable amount of source material. The BBC version, for the most part, restrains from going on its own creative tangents. It just sticks to the material, as dry as it is. I concur with the score and can say without any doubt on my mind the 1977 BBC version, Count Dracula, is the most faithful to the book. And just to reiterate, this has nothing to do with preference. I personally find the Coppola version more entertaining, but that wasn't the contest. Now, as other Dracula films come about, the contest may still go on. The funny thing is, it's a contest where nobody wanted to be the winner. Each film wanted to invent something new to keep the story fresh. But the most refreshing thing to do would actually be to make the first ever page-by-page adaptation. Yeah, it would be a long movie. It would have to be a trilogy and go full Peter Jackson style, or better yet, a TV series. Netflix, or anybody who's listening, you have an easy win here.